I've been looking forward to talking to Brian Topp, a Canadian political strategist, for, well, frankly, ever since he helped Jack Layton and the Orange Crush. Remember when Jack Layton crushed Quebec and some other parts of Canada? Some people thought he was doing so well he could just about become prime minister. Tragically, on a personal level, it was the final years for Jack Layton. They did a terrific TV movie on him. Of course, one of the reasons it's easy for me to remember that is because they had me cast, believe it or not, as a talk show host. And of course, Brian Topp was such an important part of that campaign that they had an actor playing his role as well. I did spend some time with the actor, but I never spent any time, believe it or not, with Brian Topp. So this is a real privilege for me, and I know it will be for you as well. Brian Topp, thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be here, Charles. And I spent some time with that actor too, and it was an interesting experience. Like he asked for lunch, and then he just got me talking, and he was asking me a lot of interesting questions, and then I suddenly realized that he was looking at me with absolutely unblinking attention, and I realized I'm being scanned. So he was looking at my mannerisms. He was looking at the way I was talking. It was fascinating.
He wanted to impersonate you, and he's an actor. That's what actors do, especially in biopics. And I was asked to do deep, penetrating analysis on me, to listen to tapes of me and video of me. I mean, serious. Anyway, it all worked out. That TV movie did very, very well. And of course, I should add that Kyle Irving was the executive producer. He was responsible for that happening. And Kyle Irving is the son of Bob Irving, who is, I would say, a radio legend, certainly in Manitoba. He was the voice of the Blue Mountains for a while. And here it is. It's impossible on the prairie to have a conversation without all the lines of separation, which aren't many between people. Everyone knows everyone and their families and friends. And so I'm going to turn this from a prairie conversation to a national conversation by beginning not with what you did most recently in Manitoba, Brian, to help Wab Kinew, but take us back to the days of Jack Layton. These would be days when nobody expected the NDP to be anything but the number 3 party. It had been that way for such a long time, known by people who would flatter the NDP as the conscience of Parliament and all of that. But nobody expected them to be terribly competitive. What was it about that particular contest with Jack Layton that gave you the material to have the NDP leapfrog the Liberals?
Well, it was the overnight success that was about 10 years in the making. So let's remember that, it took a while for Canadians to get used to Jack, and it took a while for Jack Layton to get used to his role. And then when he was used to it, he was incredibly good. He kind of left the last vestiges of his York political science professor persona behind, and he became really nice guy who had a really, really amazing ability to connect with people. And the public was in the mood for that in 2011. And then the events helped him. He worked hard to try to rid the government, rid Canada of the Harper government. And although he didn't succeed in what he tried to do in Parliament in 2008, the frame that he was using, which was let's work together to get things done, turned out to be a winner. And in particular, it was a winner in Quebec, which is where the center of that breakthrough was from. They had just been represented in Parliament for whatever it had been, 20 years or so, by Bloc Québécois MPs, who are essentially empty chairs. And what Jack Layton was saying to Quebecers was, instead of just sending messages through your vote, what if we teamed up? What if we worked together? We got a few things done. And Quebecers liked that pitch. And that was the nub of the breakthrough. And then building on that, he also got an unprecedented NDP vote in English Canada.
Brian, one of the reasons I was looking forward to talking to you is that you're one of the strategists who takes likability very seriously. I don't know, by the way, why some other strategists don't. I think likability is absolutely critical, and I don't care whether you're running for CEO or wanting to be CEO of a company or a union, and you're a former union leader. or a prime minister or premier. Recently in Manitoba, the premier had a likability problem. So did her predecessor. And I think it cost them dearly at the polls. We'll get into that in just a moment. But you mentioned that Jack Layton, after 10 years, came across the people as not just that York University professor, but as a nice guy. Is there something about politics where people are seeing you attack, and attack? Is there something about politics that makes many voters think that, wait a minute, these are not nice people?
There was some smart guy, I can't remember his name, who wrote a column in the Free Press a little while ago who said, people listen to television with their eyes. And
thank you.
And that's true. That is absolutely true. And at the end of a piece of the puzzle of elections, there's only one piece of the puzzle, but an important piece of the puzzle is the public asks themselves, do I want you in my living room for the next 4 years? And so you have to find a way to make a connection with people. And it doesn't necessarily have to be likable. The who will you go for a beer with thing is, I think, a little over-torqued. But certainly people have to respect you. And they have to feel a connection with you, and a positive connection with you in some way. And when you do that, then you've got an important building block to victory, for sure.
Yeah, I wrote that column about the eyes because it was after the debate that your candidate, Wab Kinew, the leader of the NDP, had with Heather Stefanson. There was a Liberal leader in there as well, but really the contest was between Heather Stefanson of the Progressive Conservatives. And I just found that during the debate, she was looking down at her notes a lot. I mean, someone can give her credit for, wanting to make sure that she was putting out the facts, but this was not an academic debate. This was a political debate. And if you're looking down and people are just, seeing the top of your head, they may get the impression that you're not all that interested in them. You've got to make that connection. And your guy, Wab Kinew, and yes, he does have experience in media, but Heather Stefanson had more than, basically a quarter of a century experience in public life. So there's no excuses here. Wab Kinew smiled into the camera, made that connection. And for all these people who keep saying that debates don't make a difference, I highly doubt that Brian Topp would say that in campaign 2023, the Manitoba NDP beat the PCs handling that debate. I doubt that you would ever say, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I highly doubt that you would come away thinking the debate made no difference.
Well, it clearly made a difference because people in Manitoba made up their minds about how to vote after that debate. And so it was well timed, certainly from our perspective, and because it was just before people started to vote in the advance. And I think people tuned in that debate, either the debate itself or the clips that flowed from it. And I think where Wab Kinew was coming from was he was not going to leave his opponent's charges unanswered. And so when they said stuff that he couldn't let stand, he replied to it. But the guts of that opportunity was like 8 to 10 minutes, basically always, 45 to 60-second minutes, where he could reach through the camera and talk directly to voters unmediated. And that's a really precious thing in a campaign. How much time do you really get to do that with voters? And he is familiar with cameras. For sure, he's a great communicator. And he knew what he needed to do. In a circumstance where his opponents were trying to defeat him by vilifying him, he needed to connect with voters, and they needed to look him in the eye and go, notwithstanding what your political opponents are saying, that's just politics, and we're going to trust you. And that, I think, was an important piece of his victory.
One of the things I had trouble understanding about the Manitoba PC campaign, and one of the reasons I thought that they could use a much better strategist, is because there are certain core values that people have, whether they live in Ontario or British Columbia or Manitoba, doesn't matter. Most of us believe in the idea of redemption. And I don't want to go down the religious rabbit trail on this one. That's not my point of doing this podcast at all. But whether you're religious or secular, you do believe that people can make a comeback. You do have hope. I realize there are some people who are dour and pessimistic for their entire lives, but I'm talking about the mainstream. Mainstream Canadians believe a person can come back. And throwing out constantly the business about what Wab Kinew did or didn't do a long time ago, and yes, he got a police record for that, but throwing that out always indicated to me that they were simply not believing that Manitobans had confidence that people could redeem themselves and make a comeback. And that to me created, in my opinion, Brian Topp, and I'm asking for yours naturally, but I want to set it up with saying that if you disconnect with people's core values by saying, no, some people don't come back, and this person, especially this indigenous person, can't come back, I think that's a message that whether you're conservative, NDP, liberal, whatever, I think that's a dark message. I think it's a negative message. I just don't think it works, and I don't think it worked for the Manitoba PCs.
Well, just a couple of quick comments on that. Canadians in general and Manitobans are decent people overall, and they expect people in public life to behave decently, and the people that they want to trust to run the government, they want to know that they're decent. And what the PCs were trying to do here was suggest that Wab Kinew was not a decent person and that he can't be trusted. And the people of Manitoba who had come to know him, he had served his apprenticeship in Manitoba politics in the opposition. That's not to be underrated. There's one of the big secrets about our system of government is that it works quite well. And one of the ways that it works well is that you spend some time in opposition getting to know the government and letting the public get to know you. The public begged to differ after they saw him and listened to him. And they had a number of opportunities in the election to hear him out, and they begged to differ. And the second thing I'll say, and look, I've been in losing campaigns. I'm not joining any dog piles on my colleagues across the way here, but I will disagree with them, as I did on many points in this election campaign. They seem to think that this was all they had. And I beg to differ. I don't think it's all they had. I think they had a much better hand to play than the one they ended up playing.
I'll ask you about that in just a moment, but I want to ask you this about Wab Kinew. I did think, and I wrote, that Wab Kinew was taking a gamble. I don't think he would have made that gamble unless he had consulted with you. So I want to get your thinking on this. I thought he was gambling with less than 2 months before the campaign. He did a speech where he spoke, and he did speak very effectively about his past record, his police record, his run-ins with the law that involved assaults. Let's just call it what it is. It involved violence. I thought it was a big gamble on his part to bring that to the campaign. Naturally, he consulted with you. What was your take on Wab Kinew's desire to talk about his personal past so close to Election Day?
Well, let me put it this way. I'll give you a quick backstory, and then I'll tell you what I think was on his mind. I worked for a number of years in Saskatchewan. If you look at my thing right here, you see that's a picture of Ray Romano right there, which just happens to be in the frame. I worked in that government. I'm proud to have done so. He was a great boss. Now, when you talk to people, especially in rural Saskatchewan these days, they have been persuaded by 3 rounds of gigantically funded Tory attack ads that you can't trust the NDP with healthcare in Saskatchewan, which is where healthcare, Canadian Medicare, was founded by the NDP. And the reason why that's the case is because the Tories who understand that healthcare is the key brand strength for the Democrats, have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to attack the NDP's record in office on healthcare, and for frankly, what I consider to be misguided reasons, my colleagues in that party in the last 3 campaigns chose not to answer. And I think what we have discovered is that a shot unanswered is a shot accepted. That when claims that are aimed at the guts of your brand are not answered, then the public will believe them. And so, I think what the Tories were going to do in the Manitoba campaign was blindingly obvious in a circumstance where they believed that they couldn't run on their premier and they couldn't run on their record, that they were going to attack Wab Kinew. And they showed their hand in multiple rounds of third party and their own party political stuff. in the advance of the election. It was perfectly obvious what they were working on. So I think where Wab Kinew was coming from, let's begin with the scheduling issue. So the first thing that he did about that was that he told us that we were going to start the campaign a month earlier than the Tories were planning to start the campaign. They wanted the campaign to start when they dropped the writ in September, and he decided that whatever they thought, he was going to give himself some more sea room, and he was therefore going to start campaigning the first week of August. So he self-declared a whatever it was, 8 or 9 week campaign instead of a short 4-week campaign. And he decided that he would start by putting out the garbage. He would start by knocking down the blindingly obvious pillars of the Tory campaign designed to disqualify him, since they obviously didn't feel they could run on their record. Now, the first thing that they were doing, and they spent a lot of money trying to get across this idea, was they were suggesting that if you vote for Wab Kinew, he will immediately increase provincial sales taxes. So the first thing that he did in the first week of August was make a statement laying out a fiscal plan and committing that he would not do that. And then the Tories stopped saying it, because every time they said it, what the answer back was, he has addressed this, and he said he wasn't going to. And then he needed to address the issues that aimed directly at his personal character, and if I may say so, an attempt to speak to the darkest angels of voters in Manitoba with dog whistles that were designed to divide people instead of unite them.
Let's just, Brian, I speak.
Let me just finish.
Okay, no, that's fine. That's fine.
And he picked a great venue and just took it head on. And basically what he was saying was, if they go low, I'm going to go high. And if they are going to try to divide us, then I'm going to talk about what it takes to unite us. And in a diverse province like Manitoba, you are playing with dynamite when you campaign that way. And he was offering an alternative. And we got back to what we just talked about a few minutes ago, that at the end of the day, people in Manitoba, like all Canadians, are decent people. And when you say we need government and political leaders who behave decently, that's what they're looking for.
I didn't want to interrupt. I just wanted to say to people, because we talk about dog whistles, and many people who are not political junkies, it's not a phrase they're familiar with. And I know this is a critical point that you want to make, and it needs to be made. When we talk about dog whistles, we're talking about racial dog whistles. We're talking about dog whistles specifically aimed at people who are thinking that indigenous people have a proclivity for crime, for violent crime, and that Wab Kinew is an indigenous person who has a police record. Therefore, what else do we need to know? Why would we elect this violent person, this violent indigenous person? And so the dog whistle isn't heard by everyone, but it's heard by the dogs. So the dog whistle is aimed at people who do have that kind of bigoted thinking, not want to give an indigenous person a chance. And if I've misrepresented your position on this, Brian, please stop me.
Yeah, well, this is right out of the Republican playbook in the United States. Suddenly every 2 years and every 4 years, there's a panic from Republicans about crime, and everybody knows what they're talking about. What they're saying is that we have to beware of Black people. And, there are this conservative campaign tried to import that playbook and to play that card to divide Manitoba on similar lines. And what was funny about it was, it's an incumbent government talking here. They're saying, we've been in office for more than 7 years. Crime has gone up. And crime is a terrible problem that must be addressed. They were attacking their own record. They were highlighting an issue that's about them, that the crime rate has gone up in Manitoba on their watch. And if they had, I'm sure that they researched this, Wab Kinew was more trusted on this issue than they were, as he was, by the way, on substantially every other issue. And so they were picking an odd issue if it wasn't about a dog whistle.
The campaign, I mean, I hate to laugh about something so serious, but the slogan they used on Wab Kinew and the crime piece was laughable. I have a feeling that's one of the reasons why Wab Kinew came out looking better in the polls on crime than the PCs. I mean, these bus benches actually said the words, because I'll never forget this, that with Wab Kinew, violent crime will be even worse than it is right now. I mean, you couldn't look at that without thinking, is this a parody? Is someone making fun of the PCs? I mean, even worse than it is right now. It's kind of like the PC saying, you know, we're doing a terrible job at this job we're doing really, really sucks. But, you know, this guy, this indigenous guy, is going to be even worse. And that's just not something that moderate people, and most people in Manitoba are moderate, regardless of their party affiliation or whether they have any party affiliation at all. To a moderate Manitoban, that's a dumb message. And maybe beyond that, it's also a vulgar message. Let me go to something specific that you talked about recently. This is about a particular riding, Kirkfield Park, which for the most of the last 50 years has been a conservative riding. Sometimes it's gone NDP, not very frequently. And it was held this time by Kevin Klein of the PCs, who won a by-election. And there was something about that by-election defeat of the NDP candidate that clearly got under Wab Kinew's skin. And I have a feeling that he basically put you on a mission to do what it takes to win that riding. Do you want to give us the backstory on that, Brian?
Well, what that highlighted is that we needed to do a better job on advance voting, and that these days there's no such thing as election day. It's election week, and a smart party will work to get your vote in the box as quickly as you can during election week and not just focus on E-Day. And if you look at the results of that by-election, we won the vote until the advance vote was counted, and then we lost it. And the reason why was because our opponents had worked to turn out their vote, and we weren't taking sufficient advantage of this wonderful gift that's been given, by the way, with all party support, and appropriately so, to make it easier to vote. And so we just had an election as Alberta, as you will know. The issues were all down to Calgary. The issues were down to the election turned on let's say 6 seats in Calgary, which were largely won by the UCP by a few hundred votes. And what that spoke to was they were winnable if you had just played your cards just a little bit better. And so, I worked on that Alberta campaign. I came out of there stinging from that and determined to do better, as well as this by-election, which was very much on Wab's mind. And so we geared our ground effort trying to learn these lessons. And the key lesson is that, first of all, these days, you need to identify your vote as early as possible. And very wisely, the Manitoba campaign had nominated most of its candidates well in advance of this election, in a number of cases, more than a year in advance. And doing this means you're losing the hope that you can recruit, quote unquote, star candidates who can't leave their jobs until 2 weeks before the writ period. But I think that's pretty overrated compared to the benefit of nominating your people earlier, which is that they can work for a lot longer, and they can canvass in their seats, and in particular, they can identify their vote. And then, having done that with some pretty ambitious goals, we set some pretty big targets that we aimed to meet, which in good part we did meet. Then we worked hard to turn out our vote in advance of the election, and that was the lesson that we learned from Kirkfield Park. And the consequence is that everywhere where there was a squeaker, for the most part, they went to us instead of the other way, which is what we were aiming for.
Brian Topp, who was the person who came up with the idea to get Lloyd Axworthy, who is a Liberal stalwart, has been for years? I'd say he's been the king of the Liberals in Manitoba for decades now. Who came up with the idea that Lloyd Axworthy ought to give a very, very public endorsement to Wab Kinew? Because I think that did make a difference. It hived off a number of Liberal votes, and that helped the NDP go over the top. Was that your idea, Mr. Topp?
Well, the relationship and the idea that Mr. Axworthy might do an endorsement like that came from Wab, because they had gotten to know each other when they'd worked together in university, and they had been talking to each other a fair bit. And one of the interesting things about Wab Kinew is that he talks to a lot of people, and so they had a friendship. I think it would be fair to say, certainly a relationship of mutual regard. And so Wab identified this as an opportunity in a circumstance in which, again, if I can say it was blindingly obvious, going into a campaign where the New Democrats and the Tories were pretty close in the polls, that people who vote Liberal federally in Manitoba were going to decide the election. And the opportunity to get an important endorsement like that from Mr. Axworthy could be really significant. Now, in terms of the tactics of it, if I guess I'll boast and say that the idea of buying the rap on the Free Press was my idea, and the reason why it was my idea was because it had been done to me in a campaign in a different province, and I tucked it away as I didn't know you could buy the front page of the paper, and so I just tucked it away and said, someday I'm going to do this to you, and the opportunity came up in this election, and it was timed for the day that the Premier called the election, basically to mess with her, to offer a counter narrative to where the Tories were going to put out their tent, and to appeal to a very important group of voters.
When you bought those ads, I was, with some friends. It's not going to surprise you, Mr. Topp, to know that most of my friends happen to vote Conservative, and I have voted Conservative for most of my adult life in Manitoba and elsewhere. And I put it all out in the shop window so people can call me partisan if they like, but I don't think it's partisan, simply to tell the truth and to be as fair as possible with both sides, as I always try to be. And so in this particular case, friends of mine are looking at that front page ad and everything you bought in the Free Press. Essentially, it was 4 different pages, and one of the pages was filled with a picture of Lloyd Axworthy and his ringing endorsement. Never seen such a character endorsement of a candidate, especially coming from a member of a different party. So I must admit, I can't remember which friend, and I always give people anonymity on these things, but one of my best friends was looking at this and said, I don't know who the son of a bitch is running Wab Kinew's campaign, but he's a genius. That's how that was seen by a particular Manitoba PC voter. That they admired what you did there. Now, there's something else that was going on in that campaign. You sort of alluded to it, but I want to get into it a little bit deeper. And this idea that the only thing the PCs had going for them, they thought, was that Wab Kinew was going to be a negative for the NDP, and so that kind of backfired, to use understatement. It was just not a very wise piece of strategy. Now, when the campaign manager, I guess I'd say your Manitoba PC counterpart, was asked about all of this, why was the campaign dirty? Why the ads? Why? She said that they had research that about a year ago, the Manitoba PCs were going to absolutely melt down. They would go from 35 seats to only 12, which is more than a 65% dump. And I looked at that comment of hers, which was made to a Free Press reporter, and I said to myself, well, wait a minute, you can't keep anything in this town a secret. If the PCs were going to be down to 12 seats, a number of us would have known about it, because these things do leak. So I didn't know what the haze she was talking about. What did you feel in your political bones, especially knowing what you know about all of the data, not just from the last few weeks, but from the last few years? What was your thought when you saw the campaign manager said that they had research telling them it was going to melt down to just 12 seats?
Well, look, I'm going to say again, I'm not going to join the dog pile on my colleague across the way. I've been there. I've managed the campaign where we got our hearts broken by not winning, and I've been yelled at in airports and gone through that whole experience. It's just a ritual in politics, the dog pile on the campaign director. But I will say this: going into this campaign, it is not true that they were looking at only having 12 seats. That's clearly the case, and I think they misread the cards, and I do find it a bit hard to understand what they did. So first of all, in part because he responded effectively to what they were trying to do. This hope that they could turn Wab Kinew into an asset for them was a forlorn hope. People in Manitoba like Wab Kinew, and they weren't able to change that. But I have a different thought about them, and I'm happy with what they did, because it was probably the worst thing they could do. But I think they misread their opportunities, and the budget that the Premier came out with in the winter was an attempt to repair a lot of the damage that they had done while they were in office. And they were able to frame it as a kind of what used to be called a good news budget with all sorts of stuff in it that they spent a lot of money talking up. And if you look at the clock spin of this campaign, by the end of July, having spent a lot of public money campaigning on the public dime, they had substantially narrowed the difference with the New Democrats. Because they still had a big hill to get over, because the Wab Kinew was much more popular than the Premier, and the public was in the mood for change, and also the issues that Wab Kinew was about to campaign on, basically healthcare and cost of living, were top of mind issues, and the government hadn't persuaded the public they were addressing them effectively. But they had certainly narrowed things a lot. And then what they did was, first of all, they went quiet for a month. They just kind of went to sleep all through August while we were going around knocking down their campaign. And then we laid out substantially all of Wab Kinew's healthcare plan, essentially unrebutted. And that was kind of weird. And then when they woke up again and they launched the campaign and they set aside all that work they had done on that budget and all that public money that they had spent talking it up. And instead, what they essentially did was campaign for 4 and a bit weeks on Tory internal fundraising slogans. This stuff that they're running on is how they raise money from their members, by getting them angry, by riling them up, by speaking to their darker angels, by urging them, you have to act now to stop this. That's how they talk in their fundraising, and they seem to port it over into campaigning. And as you have remarked, and I feel like that doesn't resonate with average voters. And there's another conservative party than that. There's a conservative party that's all about human rights. That's Diefenbaker. There is a party that cares about public education. That's Bill Davis. There's a party that thinks about the future and doesn't throw away your natural resources revenues. That's Peter Lougheed. There's a conservative party that I have never supported, that I don't share the goals for, that doesn't appeal to people's darkest angels, but tries to unite them around some kind of a common purpose that is not that destructive, that is not aimed at just getting back into office by dividing people and making them angry. And I think they had an opportunity to run that campaign, and they chose not to do it. I think they made a bad choice. And the saddest moment of it all was looking at that wonderfully graceful, smiling, warm speech that Premier Stefanson gave in her concession speech. That was a very nice speech by somebody who looked like a pretty nice person. And it's a shame that person didn't campaign for office, because if she had, she might have done a lot better.
Brian, Topp, if I had told you, without saying it's the Manitoba PC, is just talking to you as a political strategist and a friend, if I said to you, there's a province somewhere in this country where taxes are relatively low, where people's property has gone up most of the last decade by more than 50-60%, and unemployment is really low. So if I had told you that, would you have said, well, in that case, the incumbent must really be in danger? They could melt down, or might you say, well, if those things are true, Chuck, the incumbent's got a good shot? What would you have said?
I would have said that depends. So certainly an incumbent government that has a lot of economic factors working for it has got some good stuff to work with. There's no doubt about that. What scrambled all that was COVID, and I would say some serious misjudgments and poor governance of a healthcare system over almost a decade. And at the end of the day, what do provinces do? If you look at their budgets, what are they responsible for? Half of provincial budgets are about healthcare, and another quarter to 30% or so are about education. That's the business that you're in, healthcare and education. What a premier is there mostly to do is to manage those public services. Yes, provinces can affect the economy, and they can create an environment, a pro-investment environment. They can create a pro-growth environment. And by the way, Wab Kinew has that very much on his mind. Job one is those public services. That's how our system of government is set up. And when you completely fail in the eyes of the public at the biggest job you got, then there's a pretty good chance that the election is going to be about that. And you better have something smart to say about it. And instead they were doing those bus benches that you're talking about. And that was a mistake, a big mistake.
So having I don't want to put words in your mouth again, but having a relatively robust economy where people can come to Manitoba and get opportunity, not be taxed to death, fairly low energy rates, Manitoba Hydro. Just I don't want to check off every single box, but you're suggesting that when you're running for provincial government, having a strong economy with people having both income security and house price security, you're suggesting that isn't nearly enough unless you've really got it together on healthcare and education. The opponent has a good chance of beating you.
Well, I wouldn't quite put it that way. Don't get me wrong. That's pretty important stuff that you're talking about there. What people's pocketbooks and the economy, no doubt about it. One way in which Manitoba is a little different than a number of other jurisdictions is that it has seen NDP government, as Saskatchewan has. It's a little hard for the Tories to argue, if we have an NDP government in office, all is lost. Everything will be destroyed. All the employers are going to run away. The public thinks NDP, they think Gary Doer, and they know that didn't happen under his government. He was a cautious, pragmatic, Prairie New Democrat, very much in the style of Ray Romano and the Saskatchewan government of the same era. And so the kind of visceral worry that Tories try to generate about the economy when they're up against the Democrats in Western Canada probably works least well in Manitoba, because people know perfectly well that New Democrats can be trusted to manage the economy. And so as long as you don't make a big mistake, what New Democrats need to do on this issue is fight it to even. They need to get to the Tories and the New Democrats can both be trusted to manage the economy. And then in a circumstance where you have that bad a record on healthcare, then you go right at it, because it is that's what the public is concerned about, and that's the job one that the province needs to focus on, and that's what they want. That's what they want to see that they're not getting from the current government, and that is how this played out. And I don't think the outgoing government was able to answer this, because they didn't try to answer it. Instead, they focused on their fundraising slogans, and those only speak to their members, not to voters.
I don't doubt that many of us in Manitoba sometimes will view the idea of NDP government associated with Gary Doer, who was very, very successful. But some of us also view it as Greg Selinger government, because he ran the government for a number of years in between Gary Doer and Brian Pallister. So let me just ask the question this way. What did you do to make sure that NDP governance wasn't associated with Greg Selinger? Because after all, he was the one who tasted a serious defeat. Wab Kinew ran as a Greg Selinger New Democrat, and he managed to win his riding, but there weren't too many others in the caucus.
Well, the nub of why that premiership failed was a broken campaign commitment that resulted in an increase in the provincial sales tax when there had been a commitment not to do that. And that was the first thing Wab Kinew talked about in this campaign. So the first week of his campaign was invested into precisely speaking about this issue, the nub of it. And the Tories were trying to talk this up by saying, whatever he says, Wab Kinew, if you vote for him, is going to increase the provincial sales tax by 1 point. And he said, I will not. And as you very wisely pointed out, people listen with their eyes. They watched those clips. There was a pretty high awareness in the province about what he had said there. And because I think they like him and they trust him, they took him at his word. And that's how this was dealt with.
So, Brian Topp, I don't pretend to be a political strategist, but I do know a few things about politics, and I do know a few things about public speaking and public persuasion. If you've got high likables, if you've got a lot of moral authority as a premier, you can make the case that Wab Kinew will likely do a Greg Selinger and say one thing and do another and end up raising your taxes. If you've got a lot of popularity, if you've got that moral authority, if you've got that weight, you can make the case and carry the day. I would respectfully suggest to you that the reason the Tories weren't able to persuade people of that was simply because the Tories did not have a leader with high favorables, a lot of command of the lectern, and a lot of what we'll call moral authority, gravitas. Kinew beat her in the gravitas contest, and that's why I once again respectfully submit that he was able to win the argument about sales taxes.
Yeah, you might be right. I think on a nose to nose, I'm saying you'll do it. No, I won't. That the public went with him. Another piece of the puzzle is they couldn't make up their minds what they were campaigning on, and so they were throwing out tons of stuff. And if they thought that this was the key point, that what it all comes down to is let's have a referendum on our belief that Wab Kinew was going to add a point to the provincial sales tax, then they needed to talk about that for 7 weeks. And what they did was they talked about it for a week or two. There was a third-party campaign about it. They talked about it through their caucus, but then they switched off it and on to a bunch of other stuff that we've been talking about today. And so, another piece of the puzzle here was they didn't really press the argument very hard because they wanted to go to a darker place that they thought was going to be more effective. They didn't really want to debate this because they thought they had something better. And it turned out that it blew up in their face and that they learned something that I hope proves to be true in the rest of the country, which is that when you choose to stop debating public issues and instead you are going to run a campaign against murdered women and school children, that maybe you're not going to do that well.
Yeah, I think that that can be carved into stone for political science students. If you're going to run a campaign against murdered women and school children, you're not going to do that well. Brian Topp, October 2023. Brian, we enjoy having you in Manitoba, and I can safely tell you the NDP really enjoys having you in Manitoba. But I'm just speaking to you now as a fellow Manitoban. Do you have any plans to stay, or do you have to move on and take on some other major missions?
Well, I've been friends with Wab Kinew for quite a while. He and I have talked ever since he started as leader, and I hope he'll keep talking to me. But I'm going to return home to sunny Ottawa and be a good friend of the Manitoba NDP, as people are going to be across the country. Wab Kinew won a fantastic victory. He's got a great mandate. He's got a really good agenda. It's a thoughtful and cautious agenda. And he's going to remain thoughtful and cautious, I think. And all of us are going to try to help him out because we want him to succeed.
Brian Topp, it was a smashing success for you and your crew here at Manitoba. You outsmarted, you just outthought, you decisively defeated the incumbents, the Manitoba PCs. And so you've helped to make some history in helping to make Wab Kinew the very first indigenous premier in this country. Thank you so much for this. And no matter what missions you run, no matter where you choose to live in the next little while, whether it's Ottawa or any other part of Canada, thank you for this. And you're always welcome here in Manitoba.
Thank you so much. Great talking to you.
Brian Topp, he's a campaign strategist, has been for decades. And this time around, he lent his wisdom to Wab Kinew and the Manitoba NDP. And as I said a few moments ago, he won decisively. I always win when you join us, whether it's on video or audio, regardless of which podcast platform you're using. Thank you so much, and thank you for spreading the word to your friends and neighbors and everyone else who cares about podcasting. I'm Charles Adler.